Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Philip Bloom. I'm the director of the Center for East Asian Garden Studies at the Huntington. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's talk by Bruce Hamana on the role of the Japanese tea hut in understanding the way of tea. This is our first talk of 2024. We have four talks scheduled this spring. On February 15th, I'll be giving a talk on a new Chinese painting that recently entered the Huntington collection. And then in March and April, we have talks connected to the newly opened Japanese Shoya House. On March 28th, Yukio Lippert will be discussing the role of, or the relationship of the Shoya to Japanese architecture and carpentry traditions. And on April 18th, David Howell will be talking about recycling and reuse, and particularly the role of night soil in the economy of Edo, Japan. Sort of issues of sustainability connected to night soil. But today we'll be talking about tea, and to introduce our speaker this afternoon, I'll ask my colleague Robert Horry, the Garden's cultural curator and program director, to kick things off. So, Robert.
Thank you so much, Philip. Today's annual lecture is named in honor of Ho Unsai Daisosho, Dr. Genshitsu Sen, the 15th generation Grandmaster of the Urasenke School of Tea. As you know, Urasenke is one of the major schools of tea, tracing its origins to Sen Norikyu, who established chado, the way of tea, in the late 16th century in Japan. Dr. Sen, who celebrated his 100th birthday this April, made his first visit to the United States in 1951 as a delegate to the signing of the Peace Treaty of San Francisco, which reestablished relationships between the United States and Japan after the Pacific War. Since his first overseas trip, he has traveled tirelessly around the world promoting the principles of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility, which serves as the basis of chado. The Urasenke tradition of tea is now practiced in more than 37 countries around the world. The Huntington is proud to have an Urasenke tea house, Seifu-an, which was designed by Dr. Sen's brother, Otani Mitsuhiko Sensei, and built in 1964. The house was moved to the Huntington as part of our Japanese Garden's centennial celebration in 2012, and it was rededicated by Dr. Sen's son, current Grandmaster Sen Soshitsu XVI. Today's lecture is funded by an endowment from Frank and Toshia Mosher. Mrs. Mosher was in Hiroshima when the first atomic bomb was dropped, and like Dr. Sen, she has worked tirelessly to promote peace. Today's speaker is Bruce Sosei Hamana Sensei, who joined the staff of Urasenke in 1986 as part of its international division. He is an author, lecturer, and tea instructor. His most recent publication, 100 Beautiful Words in the Way of Tea, is a bilingual publication that has helped to deepen tea practitioners' understanding of Chano-yu and its cultural context. He has traveled extensively around the world as a goodwill ambassador for Urasenke Chado and has many hundreds of students, many of whom are with us online today. Bruce Sensei, thank you so much for joining us for this lecture.
Robert, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I was actually wondering who you were talking about. I'd also like to thank the Huntington for the support of Japanese culture and for also making this annual lecture available to a very wide audience. And so today I'd like to talk to you about Tea House and its role in understanding Chano-yu. And I have lots of information and slides and so forth. So without any further ado, I'd like to start. Please keep your questions, and I'd be very, very glad to answer them. So I'm going to begin. I have 45 minutes, and going to share the screen now. So please, everyone, bear with me while I get this on there. The tea environment is a very how can we say, has many different aspects to it. So we'll begin by talking about its main characteristics and so forth. The Chanoyu environment has become very, how can we say, well known in the art community and educational communities. And at the very beginning, when I first began working for the Tankokai Association, the tea houses and so forth were actually donated to many different places. But over the years, that's over 30 years, museum officials and others have become to appreciate the unique position that chado has in Chanoyu, in Japanese culture and so forth. They've recognized that it's very useful in advancing cultural awareness. It also attracts many viewers and users. So here's a picture of the Seifu-an, which Robert Cynthia has mentioned. It was donated in 1974 to the Pasadena Buddhist Temple, and it is also had been moved from there. I also noticed on the website that the tea house from Pepperdine is also at the complex, at the Huntington complex, and that it is used on a regular basis for keiko and so forth. So this effort by Urasenke to promote tea overseas is, of course, very much dependent upon having a proper environment. And so we have tea rooms in, for example, Hawaii and Los Angeles that were given at very early period. That was during the time of 14th Grandmaster, who was Tantansai. And his son, Honsai, who was a 15th generation, it also made an effort to dedicate or donate tea houses to various places. Here's one that was given to the state of Bayern to commemorate or to be used at the Munich Olympics. Throughout the world, you'll find tea houses in various museums and other places. Of course, you're familiar with the British Museum, but perhaps you may not know that the tea house that is on the, I think the gallery, Japanese galleries up on the roof, at the entrance, there is this tea room, which is called the YA-an. It's used for demonstrations and so forth throughout their schedule. Here is one at Abu Dhabi, the National Guest House, which is a huge hotel, I believe. And here is Honsai Daisosho opening the Dokusui-an. Dokusui-an means the hut or the hermitage of green water. So it is his hope that it functions as an oasis in this very, very dry country. So let's talk a little bit about the purposes or why we have tea house and so forth. Actually, I've arbitrarily divided it into two aspects or two purposes. One of them is practical. That is, we should understand the tea house as a place, a physical setting for the chaji. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens during this gathering so you can understand how the environment is very much related to what is going to be done at the chaji. Another practical aspect, of course, is that chaji is not done so often. Perhaps it's like your dinner party. That is, some people give one every week, some people give one once a month, and so forth. But it is used for keiko, or in many cases used for keiko, that is practice of the temai, which is the process or the procedure for making tea. And these temai are brought together and then will become part or the flow of the chaji, okay? The next aspect beside the practical is aesthetic. And of course, you can't actually separate them. But this aesthetic aspect, experiential aspect is very, very important. And we'll look at the psychological manipulations that the tea masters have done in order to create this very unique experience. And I think it's very important also. We talk about wabi as one of the major aesthetic aspects of Chanryu, but unless you have actually sat in the tea room and watched the light coming in, listened to the sound of the kettle, all of these things that you're experiencing with your five senses, it's very hard to talk about wabi. So the most important thing, I think, in understanding or sharing the ideas of wabi is to have a person sit in the tea room and experience these directly. So the other thing is the psychological manipulations create a special atmosphere that takes you away from the everyday world and helps you to calm down. And these are things that the tea masters in the past, and we're talking about 400 years ago, innately understood. That is, if you're in a semi-dark place, you're able to not focus, but be able to rely on other senses besides seeing. So we'll look at how that takes place. So as I mentioned, teiko is one of the major aspects. So the tea practice is always done, not always done, but preferably done in a tea house, a tea room. It is, of course, highly related, closely related to tatami culture. That is, we endure painfully sitting on our knees for this period, but it also ties us to the floor, that is, to the tatami, and to put us into a low and humble position. We'll talk about that later. But the second aspect, which I mentioned, was the experiential one, is the creation of various moods throughout the year. This is Yobanashi Chaji, which takes place in the wintertime when it's very cold. And through this, the guests are able to look at or experience the warmth of being in tea room at night, lit by candles and oil wick lamps and so forth. And so this creation of special atmosphere is very keenly experienced during the wintertime, during this Yobanashi Chaji. So let me talk a little bit about the characteristics of Sukiya Kenshiku, or Sukiya Zukuri, which is the architecture of the tea room. And there are 4 or 5 major characteristics, and I'll go through them very quickly. I'm sorry I have not translated this, but through understanding the Japanese words, perhaps you'll come to understand that the elements are very, very important in creating this special environment. One of them is that all of the pillars in the tea house, and you're very fortunate because you have the shoya and you also have the shofu-an, and you can compare them in the tea house, the shofu-an. All of the pillars are round. Maruta is a round pillar, and hashira, well, maruta is a log, and hashira is a pillar. So there are no square pillars in there, which makes it very, very difficult to make. That is, there are no straight lines amongst the architectural elements. And most of them happen to be sugimaruta, which are cedar, Japanese cedar. The other thing is that the walls are tsuchikabe, which are plastered mud walls. There are not normally in the tea room any kabegami, which is wallpaper. And so this gives the room a very warm, tactile feeling to it, okay? You'll see tsuchikabe in many other instances, but in tea room, it's almost always the plaster mud walls. The Juraku tsuchi refers to the color of the mud Juraku, of course, is Jurakudai, the palace of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and it has a very warm, brownish, reddish, yellowish, kind of dark beige color. It's very difficult to describe, but it's one of the things that also contributes to this tranquil feeling. The tenjo, the ceilings, are also quite detailed and quite counterintuitively. As the tea room gets smaller, the ceilings tend to get more complex. That is, they have different levels and they're made out of different materials. So in tea room, or in Japanese architecture altogether, there's not much on the floor. That is, there are no carpets and furniture and so forth. So one of the things is that the ceilings also in tea room tend to be rather interesting. So please look at the different materials, the different handlings and so forth. And as we progress, I'll tell you more about this, but all of the elements tend to designate some special function and so forth. So by looking at the ceilings, you can very often tell where the guests are going to sit, where the host is going to be making tea and so forth. One of the things that I think you've noticed about Japanese architecture is that the walls are load-bearing. That it's the pillars are supporting the ceiling, the roof, and so forth. That means that the openings, the fenestration, the windows, and the doors, and so forth, can be placed in almost any location. So this is very, very important because we're going to see that as the tea room gets smaller, the details and the different characteristics become more numerous. In the shoya, for example, the ceilings perhaps are mainly flat. You have shoji and so forth, or fusuma around the room, and you have tokonoma. But essentially, it's a very large box. But when you go into the shofu-an, you will notice that there's a lot going on, and that is to make the small space seem more seem larger. Okay. The other thing is that the tea house is built twice. That is, it is built and assembled without nails. Everything is fit together with very elaborate joints and so forth. Here is your tea room in Kyoto being restored by the Komuten, the construction company that specializes in the production of these elements. So this idea that it's built twice is a very important one. It is taken apart, put together at the workshop, taken apart and moved to the site. In the case of your tea house, it was actually built several times. That is, it's taken down, moved back, refitted, and then moved back again. So this, of course, is going to add to the cost. And here is it in reconstruction and so forth, and you can see the parts have been brought together and so forth. Quite amazing fact that after so many years, it's still being used as a tea house and has been restored in a very, very careful and selective manner. Here are some other features of the tea house. Here are the pillars that I've mentioned to you in the tea room. They are. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you see the pointer?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So here are the pillars that are in their round shape. There you can see various other types of materials. I call the architecture of the tea house the architecture of wood grain. So the wood grain here that you are seeing is left unpainted. Many of the, this is called masame, which are straight grained pieces. Straight grain pieces which have a very, very nice feeling. It's masame, particularly in the cut section, very, very preferred. This is the chichikabe. And as you can see, the windows have been placed, and also the door, this is a nijiriguchi seen from the inside, has been placed very, very freely. And much thought is given to where the light is coming in, where the guests are going to sit, they will be sitting here, how they will enter the tea room, and so forth. But one of the things I'd like for you to notice is that nothing is lined up. Modern architecture is very much based on the idea of the module and so forth. And of course, we know that the tatami functions as the module in Japanese architecture. But in tea world, there is a conscious effort not to line things up. So things are not lined up here. This is not lined up here. All of these things are slightly off. And that is going to cause a change in the ma. So as your eye is going here, it has to stop and adjust to go up here. And by expanding your observance or looking at this, it's going to increase the time that it takes to look at it. So one of the things when you go into tea house is to take time and just let the tea house speak to you, and then more and more of the features will become noticeable to you. Very often when I take people in, if I don't say anything, they will spend maybe about 2 minutes looking at it, right, and then leave. But there is much more that tea house is trying to say to you. And during the chaji, we're able to appreciate this because we're in the tea house for 3 hours or longer. Okay, this picture too is very bright in order to show the details, but it is not normally this bright. And the amount of work and the skill of the carpenter is quite amazing, considering that the pillars are round and we're fitting straight pieces into there, and it doesn't line up. I mean, these pillars are not straight. They are tapering up like this from the bottom to the top. The way that, for example, this is the lintel that has been fitted into the pillar, is done very, very carefully. And there's not room for paper, a piece of paper to be put inside here. So skill is very, very, very high. And we see, of course, the masame, the straight grains in the lintels and in the frame of the shoji, okay? That is the paper coverings of the windows. I really am going to have to speed up because I have really a lot to talk about. And I see that I'm really far behind. But let's talk about the flow of the guests. This is one of the most important aspects. And all of the structures in the tea environment are related to the movement of the guest. And one of the most important things is that the host and the guests have to be separated. That is, the guest should not be aware of how the host is moving in the background. So it's very much like a theater that is standard theater. You're only seeing one portion, but the backstage area is quite highly developed and also very important for the tea gathering, for the theatrical work and also the tea gathering. So in this sketch, this is the layout of Urasenke, and we go from the entrance hall into the main building, and then we go to the machiai, which is the waiting room. From there, we go out into the garden, which is called the roji. And I'll show you pictures of this later, but unfortunately, pictures of the Konichian cannot be shown. So this is the waiting arbor, and this section is very important because the host has not appeared yet. In the tea gathering, the host does not meet the guests until they have gone into the roji, and then he proceeds back to the tea room, and they actually do their greetings and so forth in the tea room itself. So the garden plays very, very important role, and we'll look at pictures. This is the tsukubai, the wash basin, lower wash basin, and then the path goes into the tea house here. This is the Konichian. So although it's not clear here, there are gates. There's a gate here, and then there is a gate here, which separate the sotoroji, outside garden, from the inside garden. Okay, so we'll look at pictures of that in just a minute. It's also possible to go to tea house in the back, which is this is the Konichian, but there is also a tea room called the Yuin. So it's possible to go on this pathway here. This is a rather complex one because there's also Soto Machiai, which is the waiting arbor in the back. And after the meal and so forth, during the middle break, the guests go to the Oku Machiai. So let's look at the tea gathering itself, the chaji. It normally takes about 3.5 to 4 hours. This is the reason that we're having chanoyu. So it's not to have okeiko or practice per se, but at the time of Sannorikyu, the chaji was how tea was conducted. That is, you would invite your guests and you would serve them tea and so forth, and they look at your utensils. Normally, it's a small number from 3 to 5, depending on the size of your room. In the past, these were done quite often. In the present day, small chaji like this is not done so often. But the important point is that the environment is designed with this specific purpose, that is to hold the chaji so that it goes smoothly, and by it being handled in such a way, the sense of harmony and peacefulness develop. Very interestingly, the form of the chaji and so forth was fairly well set during the time of Sannorikyu. Over the years, there have been changes to make it more accessible and to make things smoother, and various other developments have happened. But overall, we still do the same thing. So here we're going through a composite of various tea houses and so forth, but this will show you the dosan, that is the path that you're taking. So this is the entrance garden and the front gate. There's normally a gate symbolically to shut the world out, and also to keep the delivery men and so forth from walking in there. The guests have to change their footwear and so forth, so there is normally a little space inside the entrance hall called the yoritsuki, where they will change their tabi and take off their coats and make their preparations for going into the tea room. This is the machiai, the waiting room, and this is where the guests first meet. That is, they come to the gathering separately normally, and they gather here, and the host assistant is going to give them some hot water to refresh their palates and so forth. And this helps to set the mood of the tea gathering. In the scroll, in the alcove, there is a scroll with generally a painting or a poem, which suggests the central concept the host is trying to convey or has taken as his trope for this particular gathering. Since New Year's has already passed, I've just selected photos that suggest a tea gathering for Girls' Day, for Hinamatsuri. The guests go out into the garden and they see various things. This is shiroboki, which is, it's not stepping stones. I'm sorry, it's a palm frond broom, which is a symbol of cleanliness, but it is found at the machiai. This is the koshikake machiai, where the guests are waiting. It is a very, very simple place. It generally designates where the host, where the first guests and the other guests are going to be seated. The tobi-ishi are characteristic of the tea garden. These are the practical use of keeping your feet from getting too wet. it looks like it's rain, but this is mizumaki, which is water that is sprinkled on the path to symbolize or to embody the idea of purity, that is, everything has been cleaned. And also it practically keeps our feet from stepping in mud or walking on the moss and so forth. The tobi ishi are generally thought of a characteristic of the Japanese garden, but in the Roji, it has a very special place. Along the way, the guests might see this. This is Sekimori Ishi, which is a detour sign. It means this path is not open. Please take another path. So there are many, how can we say, silent signals that tell you what to do as you pass through there. This is the shiorido, which is a woven gate. As I mentioned, the middle gate separates the garden into two parts. That is, the outside part closer to the secular world, and the inner garden, the uchidoji, closer to the sacred place or the clear place of the tea house. Near the entrance is this hole, which is called the chirihana. It is a symbolic element, but it's normally found just before you go into the tea room. So as you take off your sandals to go into the tea room through the nijiriguchi, you will see this, and it's thought that you leave your earthly dust outside. There is also another broom. This is the warabiboki, made from fern fibers, and also it suggests or symbolizes purity. So here we see the chirihana here. This tea house is not open, but that is, the shutters are still on. But here is the chirihana. Here are the stepping stones going up into the nijiriguchi. And if you recall, the first picture that I showed you of the interior of the tea house was this facade, okay? And we have a shed roof. This is the skylight, the ski agemado, that will be opened later, and I'll talk to you about it. And here you can see very clearly that these elements are not lined up. And it often reminds me of Mondrian in the placement of the different windows and so forth. So once we get into the room, we go to the alcove and we look at the scroll. The scroll is generally thought of as the main aspect, or the I hate to say theme, but the concept of tea gathering. This one says the peach blossom is blooming in the spring wind. Okay, Chinese use this character, which means to smile, it as a word to mean to bloom. In the winter period, the first thing that we're going to do is to lay the charcoal. So this is a picture of the charcoal in basket with the various utensils and so forth. So although when we are doing tea gathering, we are not going to tea, when we're doing demonstration and so forth, you're going to see generally usucha, the making of thin tea. But in the chaji, the laying of the fire is very, very important. So here you can see the host preparing the sunken hearth. Sunken hearth period is between November and April. This particular picture is taken in March. Okay, so the placement of the charcoal, very, very interesting aspect that's very rarely seen. After heating the room and so forth, or warming the room up by lighting the fire, the host will serve the kaiseki meal. Kaiseki meal is to prepare you for the drinking of koicha, thick tea, in the second half. It is, how can we say, the etiquette or the procedure for eating is quite detailed, but it is very interesting and enjoyable time. The host serves sake, which you may not think of as being part of tea ceremony or the chaji, but sake is important element in the kaiseki meal, and that is it helps to join the guests together. Various seasonal foods, of course, are served during this time, which make it very, very pleasant and enjoyable. And after the meal is finished, the host is going to serve sweets. Here is a sweet called ichigiri, which is a traditional sweet for the Girls' Day Festival. Pink and green. It looks like a little snail, but it actually refers to mochi that has been pulled apart by hand. After having the meal, the guests go back to the koshikake machiai while the host is preparing and cleaning the room. He also opens the skylight to let light in. The first half of the gathering is in semi-darkness. That is, it is the yin period, but the second half is yo, that is the yang period. So he opens a skylight to let light in. And here you can see the detail of the various architectural elements. One of the things, very small point, but Carpenter does not line up the fushi, the nodes, so that they fit together better and also create a kind of rhythm and interest in the elements. This is chabana, which are flowers for tea room. They're always, of course, seasonal, but they refer to the theme. The host is going to make, first of all, koicha, which is thick tea. This shows tea being made during the period of the third month where the kettle is suspended by a chain from the ceiling. The koicha, thick tea, is drunk from one bowl. The guests are drinking together, so generally there's a limit between 3 and 5 people can comfortably drink from this one bowl, which is why it's very appropriate for a smaller room like the Seifu-an or other places. After having the koicha, the guests have usucha, which is thin tea. It is accompanied by higashi, dry sweets. These are for spring, early spring. And here you see the usucha, which is whiskey that is very frothy and which you are very familiar with. So the purpose of the chashitsu in the tea environment, as I mentioned, is to create this idea or the environment of harmony and tranquility that is by helping you to forget about the cares of the world. There's also the element of pilgrimage. That is, there is always a well-defined entrance from which you go through the roji. This is the idea of procession, that is, you're walking or you're moving to a special place. And you're progressively going from the outer secular world to the sacred or purified world. And you pass through various things. For example, you go out into the garden, you pass through the middle gate, you go through the nijiriguchi. So you're always entering, or these elements, these architectural elements, are giving you the feeling that you're removing yourself. You're withdrawing from the regular world. You become separated from what you normally experience in everyday world. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I shouldn't really be talking about this, but I want to share with you what it is or how we feel about this. And I need to do more research about it. And I have been looking at books and so forth about the influence of the built environment on your psychological well-being. And there are books or articles about how greenery actually does help you to feel tranquil and also to make you feel better. For example, hospitals will have a garden or something so that the patients were able to look at greenery. And it's found that it does indeed help them to get better. It also creates a good mood for them and so forth. there's also a feeling of protection and withdrawal. That is, everything is very horizontal. So generally, before you go into the room, there is a low-hanging eave that projects out over the entrance. It establishes a very horizontal line, and then you feel like you're being protected by this small space. The windows and openings and so forth, people have mentioned that the tea room is not open to the outside. So generally, we have the idea that Japanese architecture is a melding of the outside and the inside, that the demarcations are taken away, that it's very, there is the engawa, and then there's also the portion under the eave that is intermediate space. But in tea room, it is not true. The windows are very small. The opening, the nijiriguchi, the crawling in entrance is very small. So we actually do not look at the garden when we're in the tea room itself. And I hate to be using these trendy words. This probably is quite old, but several years ago, there's the idea of cocooning that is being in a small space. And as you know, Japanese, there is the so-called preference for smaller spaces. And of course, the ideal space is 4.5 mats. That's 369, 9 square feet. This is like the size of a California walk-in closet. But here we are having a social gathering in this small space. This idea of darkness, semi-darkness, and warmth and so forth also helps for us to feel that we are somehow inwardly focused. So one of the things about the tea environment is that there is a control of the stimuli. That is, visual stimulus is reduced in order to accentuate or not focus on, but allow the other senses to come into play. It's, I suppose, kind of like going to a French restaurant where you can't see the food when you're eating. But there is something to be said about that, because when we're not so visually centered, we're able to feel and see other things quite intensely. We're in this stimulus, comment, I'm sorry, going all over the place, limited area for 3.5 hours. Actually, there is a middle break, but one of the things that it does, beside the things that I've mentioned before, is that when you leave, the sensory input, that is, when you see the garden and when you go back into the world, everything just hits you all at once. And so the return to the world also has to be it's kind of like decompression. So you go in small steps as you return. And that is going to help you to feel a different, how can we say, to be in a different place when you leave. That is, you've been removed from the very world. You've forgotten about your Twitter account. Your boss isn't able to get in touch with you. Ideally, some people bring their phones into the tea room, but they shouldn't. And since we have focused our attention on these different sensory inputs, things are slightly different. That is, we're listening to the sound of the water in the kettle. We're listening to the birds. We're listening to the host whisking the tea. We're tasting. We're feeling the warmth of the tea bowl and so forth. So by having focused on these things, we're able to forget other things. So, of course, mindfulness has become such a popular thing, but this mindfulness training has been, how can we say, developed and refined in Japan for many, many years. So whenever you do anything, related to the do. That is, if you're arranging flowers, if you're writing calligraphy, if you're practicing martial art or whatever, you're able to do things with your body and therefore put your mind on hold for just that period, because the mind is in a different place. So just some, how can we say, nice pictures of details of the tea gathering. During the winter, when we enter the machiai, we have charcoal in the hibati to warm our hands. When we go out into the garden to the koshikake, and I noticed you also have a very nice koshikake in the tea house complex. This is where we enjoy looking at the garden, taking some time to actually appreciate this. So taking time is very important to look at all of these things. We purify our mouths and our bodies, but this is also a psychological element. We go into the Nijiriguchi, crawling in to a special space, and we look at and hear the sound of the water boiling in the kettle. And then we have the kaiseki meal in a semi-dark place. So in this photo, you can see the soft lighting, the way that the tea room is. This is kind of like the setup for Seifuan, that is actually where the windows are, would be where the tokonoma is, but it is Yojohan Daime. Looking at the elements, the soft light and so forth. People, just for your information, in Urasenke, the paper that is in shoji is cut so that the seams are visible, and that makes it more interesting. But it also means that each piece of paper is going to yellow or change color in a different way, and that's going to make a kind of a nice mosaic feeling. Lighting is so important. In this case, it's coming in through a side window, the sound and so forth of making tea, enjoying it in very peaceful situation. I've run over time, so I'm going to stop here and open the forum for any questions. And thank you very much for your kind attention. And I'm sorry if I'm speaking very, very fast. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce. This was wonderful. It's such a wonderful introduction to the spaces, and you make it very experiential despite it just being virtual images. So we already have several questions
Great.
that I'd like to pose to you. Multiple times during your talk, and even just now with discussing how the paper is applied to Urasenke, shoji, and windows, you mentioned how things are built so that the lines never quite line up. Could you talk a little bit more about why that design decision has been made? Why it seems like it makes it so much more difficult for the craftspeople, but I presumably it makes it a much richer aesthetic experience for the people in the room.
So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking about when or who.
Why are things built so that the lines don't line up?
Yeah, a good question. I'm not, other than what I've talked to you about, I'm not sure historically when these things happen. And of course, the oldest tea house that we have is Senrikyu's Taian. And going back and looking at it, from that period already, the lines were not, how can we say lined up? and so forth. But that tea room had been rebuilt, so it's not necessarily in the form that it was before. So as I mentioned, this is done purposely, and there is the idea in Japanese art and aesthetics that you don't want to bore the person's eye, akisasenai. Don't make them bored by looking at the same thing twice. So there is the idea of consciously trying to change things. But in terms of the actual design, I'm not exactly sure. So I cannot speak to that directly about why that was done and whether it was done purposely or whether this is some innate idea. I can't speak to that. And of course, over the years, the craftsmen who were building these things and so forth probably had a lot of leeway because, as you know, the tea master will just draw out the layout of the room and decide the elements and so forth. But a lot of the other things, the very small things, depending on the person, of course, the carpenter has a lot of leeway. So I'm thinking on one hand, the tea house designer is doing this, and on the other hand, the carpenter is doing a lot of these things. For example, the joints and the way things are constructed, they have a lot of leeway to do that themselves. Okay, it does make it more challenging for the craftsmen themselves, both the carpenters and other people. For example, the paper that I'd mentioned, the overlap is quite decided. I'm not exactly sure how many millimeters it is, but that also is decided. And that joint has to be in the center of the grid in a predetermined place. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it is a very interesting one.
I think you're pointing out the kind of interplay between the designer and the artisans is a very interesting and important point.
Yes, it is.
So I think one of your students, Rebecca Corbett, has a somewhat related question. She says, "Thank you, Hamana Sensei, for a very informative talk. I was very interested in your remarks about the psychological aspects of being in a tea room and cocooning. Could you comment on how this may differ or change in non-traditional or more modern tea rooms? So, for example, in something like an all-black tea room or an all-glass tea room, do these concepts still apply? And I guess I would take it further to ask you about the relation between designers and artisans there too, as well."
Thank you, Rebecca Sensei, for a very pertinent question. I have a prejudice against architects, design, and that's not because I don't admire what they're doing. I think it's really good. The one thing is that anybody who's attempting to design a tea environment should at least have experienced it. That is, glass tea room is great, and Sugimoto Hiroshi has done a wonderful thing, and I greatly admire it. But I always wonder what happens in the middle of summer. It's going to be like an oven. And the other thing is that I didn't mention it, but the separation of host and guest, there's always a really, really ample space for the preparation room. And that's where Safe One is really great, because the preparation room is almost as large as the tea room itself. And you do need that space. So an architect almost never plans where you're going to make the tea that is get prepared. So in the glass tea room, you'll see him, the guest will see the host moving all of his things out there. They will see him going outside, picking up the things and coming in, which you don't normally see in a regular one. Okay, so in answer to the question, what do I think about it? I think it's really important to experiment with the different forms. And perhaps you've seen on Facebook a tea house that was built at the in Berlin by Ohi Chozaimon and his brother. And the tea room itself, I think, is 8-mat room, but the room itself goes up to an octagon, and there is a huge skylight, and the walls are canted in like this. And very interestingly, it works really well, but the structure itself is modern, made out of metal and other things. So it is possible, but I've seen many modern ones, but I don't think the designers have ever actually sat through a chaji to experience all of it. Otherwise, they would certainly give you more space. I'm sorry, if it's all over the place, but that's my take on that.
Excuse me. There are two questions about the relationship of hosts and guests, so that are kind of, about the actual practice rather than the space. But how's the order of guests determined? Does the host simply decide who will be the first guest, the second guest, and the third guest? And then during the actual consumption of the meal and the tea, what's the nature of the conversation? Is it the host who primarily is speaking? How do guests engage in conversation?
So the question was, what is the relationship between the guest and the host, and how is the first guest decided, and what goes on during the actual tea gathering? It is said, I was taught that the first guest is decided by the host, and he will send the invitation, and he will bring along other guests. In reality now, the host is going to send an invitation with the order of the guests generally. So the first and last guests are very important in the chadis. So first guest is the person to whom he is inviting or thinking about in the gathering. And then the last guest is a kind of a helper in the tea room. So those two people need to know what to do. And in the modern situation, generally people who are less experienced are in the center. Practically the order is already decided. And concerning the conversation, it depends on the relationship between the host and the guest. The conversation is normally directed between the first guest and the host. So generally, their interchange is fairly decided, that there are certain periods that the first guest says, please take out your sake cup. And the first guest, the host says, no, I haven't prepared one because I want to drink from your sake cup. So that kind of thing is set. But he is also moving along and pouring sake for the other guests, and they're able to talk and so forth. And in Okeiko, we don't ever practice that. So that's why it's not so natural. That is, the first guest has all of this stuff to say and timing and so forth. So they get really nervous about it unless they've done it a lot of times. And the other guests are not so comfortable perhaps, but ideally they're all talking to the host in appropriate fashion and so forth. And the other thing is that you have to remember that the host is serving and making the tea, and he has all of the things to keep in his mind. So if you constantly ask him questions about if the host is not experienced, he will lose his train of thought. But ideally, it's a social gathering, so there should be more talking and there should be more interchange, which sometimes there's not. It's a very interesting situation.
Great, thank you very much. There's another question about the naming of tea rooms. You mentioned several quite interesting names at the beginning of your talk. What do those names, or how are those names determined? Do they have something, are they related somehow to the tea space, to its interior design, to some sort of external factors? where do the names come from, and what do they mean?
Very, very good question. Very good question. There are many different ways. Sometimes the person who is asking for the name to be given to their tea house will ask for a specific name. Very often, the Grand Master is thinking about the location. For example, we saw the Rokusui in Abu Dhabi because it's a dry place. So the idea of oasis was a very interesting one. Some feature, the naming can be influenced or inspired by many different things. I'm not exactly sure about the actual process and so forth. Seifu on the hermitage of the hut of pure wind, perhaps is related to the wind or the movement of tea ideals to the New World, to America at that time. Very good question. Very often, the only way that you can discern that is to ask the person or the host at the tea gathering, why was this name given? And you'll see, even in Japan, tea houses have many, many different names, and they refer sometimes to the location, to the host and his occupation or something like that, or his family, and many, many different ways that they can be decided.
You mentioned that there are nighttime tea gatherings as well as daytime. Is there considered to be an optimal time of day for a tea gathering, or do they just simply have such different feelings and functions that they're not really comparable?
Very good question. Conventionally, the standard or orthodox tea gathering is at noon, so it's called the shogo, and it starts at 11. So you go there for what is lunch. And then, depending upon the season, there's one in the early morning and one in the early evening. So that would be for breakfast or for early dinner or supper or whatever you call the evening meal. So by convention, we hold the tea gathering in the morning, which is called asacha, during the summertime, because it's still cool and so forth. So we have to think about what it was like 400 years ago without air conditioning and without screen doors. Reason they do it in the morning is because apparently insects are not flying around in the morning, but in the evening, if you open the windows, which you need to because it's hot, and you light candles in the tea room, going to be attacked by night insects. And in wintertime, we'll have the tea gathering, which is called yobanashi, at night. So the tea room, the tea environment still rather warm. So you go there after the sun sets. So you'll be going through the tea environment with candles and all of these old style lighting elements. It can also be held between the meals. So those are called the hango, which means after the meal. And food is not served in that situation, but only the sweet for the koicha, and maybe some noodles or some light refreshment and so forth. And so it can be held at any time of the day. And there are generally conventions about what would be appropriate for what season.
Thank you very much. There's another question about the orientation of tea rooms. Is there a particular pattern in the orientation of a chashitsu relative to cardinal directions?
Yes.
Yeah.
A good question. Somebody has been reading their tea literature. The ideal room is going to be oriented toward the south. That is, the entrance is at the south. And then the tokonoma in the northeast quadrant. And that comes from Chinese feng shui, that is geomancy, and the city of Kyoto, houses and so forth are always more ideally situated so that the back is toward the north, with tokonoma, the very important element called the kimon, blocking out evil spirits, which are which are coming from the northeast. So generally, at Urasenke, there is a tea house called the Ewing that is, how can we say, oriented in the orthodox and ideal fashion, and that's how it is. And it's very complicated. That is, it relates to the cardinal directions, and it also relates to each square. There are 3 on each side from the placement of the tatami are also coordinated to the feng shui ideals and so forth. I don't know if that answers your question, but that is a special field of study in itself.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. There are 2 questions about COVID. So one is about the sharing of, you mentioned with the koicha, the sharing of the tea bowl. Has that practice continued post-pandemic? And similarly, were there any changes in the chaji more generally, in the ceremony more generally, during or after the pandemic?
Very good question.
In terms of like washing hands, or in terms of the consumption of the tea itself, or the consumption of other the sweets or foods during the ceremony.
Yes, very good question. So during the period from 2020 to 2023, we tried as much as possible not to have cross-contamination. So the guests were served in the koicha section, individual bowls, and they revived a specific procedure for the serving of individual bowls that had existed maybe from the time of the Spanish influenza or something. I'm not exactly sure historically, but anyway, that there was that precedent, and that is continued. Of course, now some people are very concerned about it, and will continue to serve individual bowls. And of course, the idea of sharing drink or food from one vessel is really important in Japanese culture, because we don't normally do that. So for example, the Japanese wedding is sharing sake from one cup. The groom and the bride will share sake, and that embodies or manifests their union. So that is the reason for drinking the koicha like that. And then in the kaiseki meal, the host is asking to drink sake from the first guest's cup. And that also is a very important aspect, because in feudal Japan, nowadays we pour for our superiors, but in the past, a lower person could not pour for the upper person. So that is why the host reverses the role and receives sake from the guest. So he's putting himself down by receiving sake from there. So that symbolism, because of COVID, a lot of people will avoid it. That is, the host will go by and give everybody their sake and their tibit to eat with it, without exchanging cups. So I'm not exactly sure when that is going to return. It's a kind of a personal thing, and it depends on some guests who are older, for example, don't want to be drinking tea from someone else. And I've never heard that people became ill either with COVID or influenza or whatever from drinking from someone else. I think being in the same room is quite dangerous already. So I think if they're really worried, they would not go in the first place.
There are 2 kind of there are two questions, I guess, more about aesthetics that I think are related. So one is there a concept of what in Chinese is called zhuo? In Japanese, I think it would be tsutana or setsu, like kind of a awkwardness. Um, it's like a hand radical and then a deru no deru. Yeah. So is tsutanai. Is there that concept in Japan? It's a very important aesthetic concept in China.
Oh,
Eh,
oh.
I'm kind of wondering if that somehow relates to wabi, possibly. And so there's another question about wabi-sabi, whether specifically the question is whether wabi came from tea or whether wabi somehow led to the creation of the tea ceremony.
So many aspects to that question.
Yeah, I know.
In terms of the first one, I'm not familiar with the setsu, that particular aesthetic concept from China. So I can't talk about that per se. And it's very, very interesting. And I've also found that, for example, Koreans have a very, very highly developed kind of rustic aesthetic, which I need to also study more. Because when I was in Korea, I noticed many tea houses and tea establishments and so forth have many of the same elements. And I don't know if there was sufficient exchange between Korea and China to have that aesthetic come here or inspire the wabi aesthetic. Then talking about the wabi aesthetic, what was the question about setsu and wabi?
So the question was actually, did wabi-sabi derive from tea or did wabi-sabi lead to tea?
Very good question. And if you read the literature, the idea of wabi was very much related to the idea of kare and hie, which are poetic aesthetic ideas. That is the feeling of loneliness and the feeling of not being complete or to be very, very simple and so forth. So since I'm not a scholar, I'm not able to talk about that so much and how it developed and so forth. But from my meager knowledge, that the idea or the general idea that inspired wabi had already existed and was important in the early formation of it. Although the idea of hie and kareru in poetry, I'm not exactly sure how that relates to wabi, so I can't speak to that directly. But wabi ideal has become very popular outside of Japan. I think it was in 2017, the international design trend, which forecasts or actually creates these trends in the design world, was very popular. And you may have noticed a lot of books being published lately about wabi-sabi in English. And that is a totally different question or another topic for lecture. But in order to understand it, that is why it's so important to have tea room. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, to sit in the tea room and to look at the flowers, which are only there for one day, to have tea with the various utensils. And the smaller the room, the more you can experience or understand that experientially. That is, it's not so possible in a 8-mat room or something, but when you get into Seifuan, that's 4.5 mats, which is considered the border between a large room and small room. But because it has a daime, that is the next to the tokonoma on the side. That mat is only 3/4 large, and that area is extremely wabi. So by having that attached to the 4.5 mat room, that room is in the wabi style. But there are so many things going on. There's a showing on the side, which is of a very formal type of architecture. So anyway, encourage your guests and people who want to find out more about it to actually experience it and look at that during tea gathering.
Since you mentioned the 4.5 mat tea room as a kind of mid-sized standard, there's a question also about how basically what you have to do to conceptually what you have to do to create a larger tea room. Like, do you still follow the same kind of compositional rules, or how do you go from that standard 4.5 mat to creating a larger tea space? What has to change in terms of design?
So the question is, how can you expand the 4.5 tea room to be a larger room?
Right. What, as someone is thinking about designing a tea room, how do they approach a larger tea space differently from how they might approach designing a standard 4.5 mat room?
So most important thing about designing tea room is almost everybody starts out with designing the tokonoma, the alcove. But the most important thing is to design, first of all, where the row is going to be, that is the open or sunken hearth. In the 4.5 mat room, the placement of the row, the sunken hearth, is in a position called yojo hangiri, which means that there is a half mat on the far side. So the relationship of the row and where the tea spaces, where the tea is going to be made, is set. And there are actually 4 placements of the row in the standard position, and then 4 in the opposite position. So regardless of that, first you think about that, because from there, the entire room is going to be decided. And you can, the placement of the row determines where the guest will sit. It also determines where you enter. So where the host is entering into the tea room. So with that relationship established, then you can expand it or shrink it. So generally 4.5 mat and 8 mat room are fairly similar. And it also depends on what you want to do there. So I'm thinking that the person probably wants to have keiko, that is practice, and then also have guests and tea gatherings and other things there. So what you can do is have a 4-mat room here, and then have shoji around it with a hallway, tatami hallway around 2 sides. And then you can take the fusuman shoji out and expand it to 8 mats. The mat is going to be kind of, how can we say, out of position, but generally it will be work okay. Actually, this is a very big question, so you have to study or ask an expert to help you with the design. But it is possible, and in Japan, very often a small tea room has been later expanded and incorporated into a larger building, larger structure, so that when they take out all of the partitions, it will become part of a larger room or be attached to a larger room where they could have more guests.
I think maybe we'll pose 2 more questions. One is just simply, what is the role of tea in contemporary Japan, and how accessible is something like the tea ceremony to an average Japanese person today?
So the first part of the question was, what is the role?
Mm-hmm.
It is very important because, as you know, Japan is very westernized, and most people don't have tatami room in their house. So that is one of the basic things, because if you have a tatami space, you could do tea there, you could have keiko and so forth. But if you don't, then you're limited to doing it on a table or a stand and so forth. So it is possible. And when we enter, or when we decide on the tatami format, that's going to influence, for example, wearing kimono and so forth. So it will lead to many, many other things. In terms of its actual practice, much less than during the Showa period. We're finding that young people not so interested in traditional lifestyle. They're very much interested in other things. And if you give them a chance to Insta and take photos, maybe perhaps it will get more popular. But generally, people in tea world are very conservative, so they don't like to have that happening. Although, for example, Urasenke is making more effort, and there is a division that is solely devoted to teaching tea in schools. So I'm teaching tea at two places. One is middle school and high school, and another is pastry school. But these are students who are all under 20. And it is a great challenge because most of them are not interested in traditional things. So I have to lure them with sweets and so forth. And I cannot be so strict with them because they just get really upset and so forth. But as people get older, we find lots of younger women and younger men even becoming more interested in various aspects. The practice of going to keiko and it's naraigoto, which is learning activities and so forth. And of course, women are much interested because it includes a lot of this really sexist statement, but feminine activities like wearing kimono, arranging flowers, and so forth, which generally the West is not considered a masculine activity. And the other question was what?
That was the first question, and then the second question actually is for Robert, if he can rejoin us. Robert, will the Huntington ever offer a tea ceremony?
Yes, absolutely. It's something that we're looking forward to doing. We also have the Shoya House, and we are looking to open the Shoya House for activities, including tea ceremony. I am concerned about COVID. COVID is still with us, and having small gatherings in closed spaces. So it's something that we will have to work out.
Great, thank you. Well, Bruce, thank you so much for your engaging talk and for responding so generously to these many questions. There are dozens of expressions of thanks for your insights, for your teaching, and for sharing your time with us today. And Robert, thank you for bringing us all together. So the next lecture in the Center for East Asian Garden Studies lecture series will be a hybrid. It will take place at the Huntington, but will also be broadcast on YouTube. And that will be on Thursday, February 8th, again at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So thank you again, Bruce, and thank you all for being here.
Thanks
Good
so much.
evening.
ありがとうございます。